I want to talk about why we might have good reasons to believe that Jesus was who he said he was, that he is who the New Testament records him to be, and that he did in fact rise from the dead. Those are historical questions. Those are questions about events that either did or did not happen in history. And we as curious intellects ought to ask questions as we would of any event in history. Is there any reason to believe that these are true? Granted, they're supernatural. They're mysterious. They're different than other historical events, but we should be able to explore them as a historian would explore any other historical event. So today I want to talk about the evidence that we might have for the historicity of the story of Jesus. First of all, let me address an issue that some people have with questions like this. Some people are afraid that if they ask questions like this, that God will be mad at them. They either are believers, or they used to believers, or they have some kind of guilty hangover from church that tells them it's not right to ask questions. Or maybe they don't believe at all, but they've asked questions like this and they've been brushed aside by people who call themselves Christians and haven't welcomed these kinds of questions. Let me assure you, Jesus loves it when we ask questions about him. He's not afraid of them, he's not intimidated by them, and he's not mad at us for asking. Look at the stories of Jesus himself. Look at how he dealt with good questions. The story goes that Jesus died and rose from the dead, and then he appeared to some of the apostles. But Thomas wasn't there when Jesus appeared to them. So the disciples went and got Thomas and said, "Come and see, Jesus has risen from the dead." And Thomas said, "I will not believe until I put my hand in the holes that are in his hands, left from the nails of the cross, until I see the hole in his side where they shoved a spear. I won't believe until I see those things." Jesus appears to Thomas and says, "Thomas, here, look at my hands, look at my side." Jesus welcomes empirical investigation of his story. He doesn't shame Thomas, he doesn't scold Thomas, he doesn't refuse Thomas. He satisfies Thomas's questions. So Jesus is not at all put off by questions about the story of the resurrection. Nor were the disciples of Jesus. In the first century world, people heard the story of Jesus and obviously asked, could this be true? How do you know? And at one point, in his letter to the Corinthians, the Apostle Paul says, there are over 500 people who saw Jesus risen from the dead. The implication is, if you want to know, go ask them. He says, some of them are still alive. Go talk to them. Go find out for yourself. The apostles don't dissuade people from asking good questions or pursuing intellectual curiosity. If anything, they encourage it. So when you come to questions like this, do we know that Jesus rose from the dead? Is there any historical evidence to support it? Don't worry about asking the question. I'm glad you did. So is Jesus. And there are good answers to questions like that. There's a scholar named John P. Meyer who set out to investigate what can actually be known historically about Jesus. He wrote 4 volumes on the subject called A Marginal Jew. In it, he proposes a situation. He says, imagine 4 people being locked in the Harvard libraries: a Christian, a Jewish person, an atheist, and an agnostic. Let's say you lock all 4 of them in the Harvard libraries and you only give them a limited amount of food. And you tell them, you can't come out until all 4 of you agree on what can be known about Jesus. So in other words, it has to satisfy believers and unbelievers alike, looking only from the perspective of historians. He came out with 4 volumes summarizing his answer to that question, all the things that might be known historically about Jesus from the perspective of a skeptical historian. Now, for a devout fundamentalist, the book is a little offensive because he doesn't support everything that's in the New Testament. But he does support the critical foundation that lies behind believing that Jesus rose from the dead. Meyer says that in his lifetime, if Jesus was known for anything at all, Jesus was known for being a healer and an exorcist. This is important because a lot of people grow up going to church in America and thinking that Jesus was primarily a teacher who sat out on the hillside offering nice moral teachings. Meyer says that's not really what attracted people to Jesus. What attracted people to Jesus was that he was a wonder worker. He did incredible things. And stories about his miracles spread and attracted more people to come and see him. He didn't attract crowds through teaching moral lessons. He attracted crowds through working miracles. Meyer says unquestionably, if anything can be known about him, we can know that that's what he was known for. Even if you don't believe in the supernatural or the miracles, a historian would have to acknowledge that in Jesus' day, Jesus was known as being a miracle worker. Meyer also dismisses fairly quickly the nonsensical account of Jesus that claims that he never even existed, that the whole thing is just made up. Meyer says no historian can land on this, and truly no historians do. The few scholars that try to come out with an argument that says Jesus didn't exist at all are usually just sensationalists looking to publish their works. But all historians acknowledge whatever went on 2,000 years ago, there was a guy named Jesus of Nazareth. Whatever you do or don't believe about him, he lived, and he was known as a miracle worker. So the question then becomes, what can we actually know about his life? And how do we evaluate it? Well, as historians, we can see that there are multiple sources that point towards the story of Jesus. You may think of the Bible as just a single source because it was compiled into one book. But originally, it was different letters written by different authors. There's absolutely no debate about this in scholarship at all. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, James, Jude, Peter, whoever wrote Hebrews, there were a number of different authors who attest to the story that Jesus rose from the dead. They all claim it in their own voices. The details of their stories are sometimes different, but there's no question that all of them believed passionately that Jesus rose from the dead, and their lives were radically transformed by that message. So as historians, we know that there are multiple stories pointing in the same direction. They obviously have not been edited to be cleaned up to synchronize with each other because there are significant details that stand out in conflict with one another. One of the Gospels says that there was one angel at the tomb of Jesus, and one says that there were two. It may seem like a minor detail, but what's important about it is it tells us nobody went back and fixed it. Nobody went back and corrected the Bible or edited it so that it all looked cleaned up. And that actually adds to the credibility of the Bible. If all the details had been cleaned up, it would look a little bit suspect. It would look like somebody had fixed the details. But in fact, there's a lot in the Bible which has not been corrected. Another criteria that historians use when evaluating whether or not a historical account is true is known as the criterion of embarrassment. I think John Meyer is actually the first person to call it that by name, but historians had used that before in different forms to evaluate the claims of history. The criterion of embarrassment simply works this way. It says, if a story is told in history that is embarrassing either to the person who is telling the story or to the hero of the story about which it is told, the story is probably true. We don't like to tell embarrassing stories about ourselves. We like to glorify our heroes and minimize their weaknesses. Embarrassment is generally an emotion that most of us avoid. I remember a moment when my daughter was a little girl and she came down to breakfast one morning, and the bangs across her forehead had been cut at a 45-degree angle across her head. She sat down to breakfast like nothing was wrong. And her mother looked at her and said, "What happened to your hair?" And she said, "I don't know." And my wife said, "Did someone cut your hair?" And my daughter says, "Maybe." And my wife said, "What do you mean, maybe? You mean somebody sneaked in your room in the middle of the night and cut your hair and you don't know who it was?" And my daughter said, "Maybe," because she was embarrassed to admit that she had cut her own hair. And when little kids cut their own hair, it usually doesn't go well. That's how we do with most embarrassing stories. We tend to try to edit them or minimize them or not tell them or not let them be repeated because we don't like to be embarrassed. Nobody likes the feeling of being ashamed. When we come to the stories of Jesus, it's important to look at what elements of the story are simply embarrassing to Jesus himself or to the early Christians. Because if someone were fabricating a story or cleaning up a story, they would probably edit out a lot of the more embarrassing details. But in fact, the gospel stories are rife with elements that would be embarrassing to a first century Jewish person. If you understand the context and the mindset of a first century Jewish person, you'll realize there's absolutely no way they would make up the stories of Jesus as those stories read today. A first century Jewish person did have a concept of a Messiah, a Savior that was to come. But the Messiah was not a heavenly being. It was a powerful general, like King David, who had been on the throne 1,000 years before. It was actually supposed to be a descendant of David, who would rise up like David, being a mighty warrior, killing Goliath, fighting our Philistine armies, and taking control. He would then throw out Rome and reign as a king over the kingdom. Jesus was born in a manger, grew up as a peasant, a carpenter, appeared sort of out of nowhere, and did a ministry for 3 years that got him killed in the end. This is not the Jewish conception of a Messiah. This is not at all what they wanted or what they were hoping for. On top of it, Jesus was crucified for blasphemy. The Pharisees handed him over for making claims about himself, which elevated him to equivalency with God. Read the Gospel of John chapter 10. Jesus says things like, "I and the Father are one." And the Pharisees then pick up stones to throw at him. Stoning someone to death was punishment for blasphemy. And they knew that Jesus was claiming to be equal with God. That's the kind of embarrassing story you don't make up about your Messiah. You want the Jewish people to respect him because you want the Jewish people to follow him. You don't go around concocting stories that make him look terrible. What we need to do is take the core of the story of Jesus and ask, is this embarrassing to him or to the early Christians? This is the earliest account of the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's the message that Paul preaches. He writes a letter to the Corinthians and he says, I'm going to repeat to you what I told you at the very beginning. So this is possibly the oldest creed the Christian church has ever had. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 at verse 1. Now, brothers and sisters, I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you, which you received and on which you have taken your stand. By this gospel you are saved, if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you. Otherwise, you have believed in vain. For what I received I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and then he appeared to Cephas, which is Peter, and then to the 12. After that he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, and then to all the apostles, and last of all he appeared to me also. The earliest account of the gospel is the basic story that Jesus died, physically rose from the dead, and then appeared to many people, including the disciples who had run away from him and abandoned him, and the apostle Paul, who had gone around killing Christians. When you read the stories of Jesus' death and resurrection, as they're recorded in the Gospels, there are multiple instances of events that they should have never fabricated, and certainly someone should have edited out. Number one, look at the burial of Jesus. The Gospels say that Jesus' body was taken by a Jewish leader, Joseph of Arimathea, and that he was buried in Joseph's tomb. Well, the problem is, the Jewish leading class, the ruling council, were the ones that handed Jesus over to the Romans for crucifixion. If you're going to make up a story, you're not going to go and make one of those guys the hero. They were the bad guys. The Gospels are angry at the Pharisees, all of them. None of them speak of the Pharisees with any respect at all. So to have Joseph magically show up and take the body as a fabrication is ridiculous. The Christians were probably made uncomfortable by the fact Joseph was responsible for it. And yet, there the detail is. Joseph was the one who took the body. Secondly, after Jesus rises from the dead, the first people to the tomb are the women who followed Jesus. Now this is important. In the first century world, in the Jewish context, the testimony of a woman was not respected. She was not a credible witness in court unless there were multiple voices speaking in her favor. Women were seen as second-class citizens and property. You needed a man's testimony in court to have credibility. If someone were going to make up the story of people finding Jesus risen from the dead, you would not have women be the first people at the tomb. You would fabricate the story and say that the men were the first people at the tomb. Matthew or John or Peter, one of them found the tomb empty first. But that's not how the story goes. This embarrassing and awkward detail is included in the stories because, reasonably, it's historically accurate. They have no other reason to include it. Thirdly, there are multiple stories of Jesus appearing to the apostles after he's risen from the dead. But the stories are not cleaned up. Sometimes he appears to them and they don't recognize him. They even walk along with him on the road and talk to him, but it's not until they leave him that they realize who they were talking to. The stories are even mysterious now. You look at them and you say, what was going on there? Did Jesus not look like Jesus? How come they couldn't recognize him? If they were going to fabricate stories about Jesus rising from the dead, they would make it as clear as possible. They saw him. They knew it was him. They touched him. All of them believed at the same time. There wouldn't be any ambiguity about the fact that it was him. But his appearances on the road to Emmaus are mysterious. There's no reason why early Christians would have made those up. Those are just a few little details that show that there are embarrassing details included in the stories of the death and resurrection of Jesus that just wouldn't be put there by somebody who is creating a legend, nor by somebody who is editing it to make it look good. Those details are in there despite their offense, which for a historian simply lends to their credibility. The stories of Jesus dying and rising from the dead are historically factual. They are not made up. You can look at all the stories of Jesus from the same lens and see the same thing is true everywhere. Look at the narrative of his birth. That's embarrassing from one end to another. The first people to know that he's coming are magi, which is a word that is only used in the ancient world in the scriptures of the Zoroastrians. That's a different religion. The people who knew by looking at the stars that the Jewish Messiah had come were not Jewish people. You would never make that up if you were a Jewish person. Other religions were horrible. God hated other religions for the Jewish people. So to have the Magi show up at Jesus' door was an embarrassment to the Jewish people. You wouldn't have your Messiah born to an unwed mother. That's horrifically embarrassing. Don't think about modern day America. Think about the world 2,000 years ago. A woman who had a child outside of wedlock was often put out on the street. You wouldn't have Herod kill off 2,000 boys trying to find the Messiah because that makes it look like your God doesn't know what he's doing. There are all kinds of details in the story of the birth of Jesus, which are not the kind of stories that people would make up. They're simply too embarrassing for a Jewish person to dream them up or include them or not edit them out. Now, given the plausibility of the story of Jesus' historicity, look at what happened after he rose from the dead. A couple of things. One, the church spread like wildfire. Within 30 years, Paul had visited multiple cities and was writing letters to them because Christian communities were being formed. They were being formed with the witnesses saying there are multiple people who saw him risen from the dead, go ask them if you want to, and two, we the apostles can work miracles of healing at the laying on of our hands. Those stories would not have caught on if they weren't being verified. You can't go to town saying, I can work miracles, and then not do it, and have someone believe in you. The early church spread with claims of miracles and claims of witnesses to the resurrection of Jesus. There was no ambiguity about how fast that movement spread. And unlike other religions, it did not spread by force. The disciples did not take up swords and conquer cities, the way leaders of other religions did historically. Instead, they went to cities with a message of love and service, and the church spread through that kind of leadership. Now look at what happened to the stories of the early disciples. The oldest accounts we have show that they scattered throughout the Mediterranean world, and many of them, in fact mostly all of them, except maybe John, died defending their faith. They went to their deaths claiming that they had seen Jesus risen from the dead. Now if the stories were fabricated, at the point that you're about to be killed for it, it's no longer worth maintaining the lie. That's the point at which you crack. That's the point at which you say, forget it, I just made this up, I'm not keeping it up anymore. But the ancient historical accounts, if you look at Josephus and Tacitus, claim that the disciples went to their deaths defending the story of Jesus' resurrection. They would not surrender that story on penalty of death. That makes an awfully strong claim for their message. Finally, think about this. There have never been any credible alternative accounts of where the story of Jesus came from. Nobody in history has come up with a foolproof, airtight account of who could have dreamed this story up and propagated it within 60 years after Jesus' death. Remember, we have the letter of Clement of Rome from 95 AD that cites from multiple texts of the New Testament that shows those letters were already in circulation in the first century. If that's the case, the church within 60 years spread all over the place. The disciples went to their deaths defending the story that Jesus rising from the dead was true. And there have been no alternative accounts to who in that very brief period of time could have dreamed the whole story up and spread it everywhere. People have tried to say, well, maybe it was Paul. Paul was martyred at Rome in 65 AD. Paul was yet another one who gave his life defending the claim that he had seen Jesus appear to him. There has been no alternative account that's even remotely plausible. It's not the kind of story a first century Jewish person would make up anyway. So there's a great big mystery out there for anybody who claims to be an atheist, who claims that the story of Jesus just isn't true. Where did it come from then? Where did this powerful story come from? Inviting people to explore its evidence, sending people to their deaths as martyrs who refused to give up the story, all within 60 years while the church spread all over the Mediterranean. There really isn't an alternative account for the story of Jesus. And that's because the story of Jesus is absolutely true. Now, often when I go down the path of talking about the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus and for the story of Jesus generally, one of the objections that people like to bring up are that there are other religions that spread too. Look at Islam. Look at Mormonism. Well, my answer is yes, let's look at Islam. Let's look at Mormonism. Islam claimed to be the revelation given from God to Muhammad, which only Muhammad could hear. There's no miracles that anybody witnessed. It was simply Muhammad saying, I hear God speaking, write down what I tell you now. You really either have to take him at his word or not. And if you have to take someone at their word, as a matter of trust, you need to look at the life they've lived. What did they do, and do they seem like a trustworthy person? What we know of Muhammad is that he was a caravan raider who murdered people and stole from them prior to receiving his revelations from God. And after receiving his revelation from God, he said things like, God says that men can have 4 wives, but I, the prophet, can have as many as I want. And the best accounts we have show that he did have between 11 and 16 wives, one of whom was a 9-year-old girl. You can look at the type of life that Muhammad lived and make your own decision about his credibility. But unlike the story of Jesus, there's nothing supernatural that anybody could point to verify it. It all boils down to whether or not you take him at his word. And as a reasonable person, I don't know why I would throw my entire life at the feet of someone who has no proof of what they're saying and trust that everything he says came from God. Look at the story of Mormonism. Joseph Smith's life has now been widely exposed. He was an adulterer who slept with many of his friends' wives. He was on a campaign for power. He, in fact, was running for president when he died in prison during a prison riot. There's very little about Joseph Smith's life that lends itself to any kind of credibility at all. And just like Muhammad, he claimed to simply hear a revelation from God. He claimed that an angel appeared to him and translated golden tablets to tell him his message. He never could produce the tablets, and nobody's ever seen them since then. There's nothing to verify the story of Joseph Smith. And the story of his life is not a credible one. It's not a good one. He didn't live well. He lived a greedy, self-centered life. And there's no reason why I would trust that somebody like that was hearing from God and had a message that I ought to give my life to. Joseph Smith's own mother even said that he liked to make up stories when he was a boy. It's very unlikely that the story of Mormonism is true, and I see no rational reason why anybody would commit themselves to it. But the story of Jesus is very different than that. Jesus worked miracles and invited people to witness them and to come and believe in them. He said, if you don't believe in me, at least believe on the grounds of the miracles that you see. He lived a life of love and self-sacrifice. There's no account of him owning anything. He didn't get rich. He didn't seek out wives or women. He died as a martyr after only 3 years of his ministry. And all we see in his ministry is that he went around healing the sick, loving outcasts, and getting in arguments with self-righteous, condescending religious people. The story of Jesus is wholly different from the story of other religions in our world. And the story of the New Testament is one that is historically validated. Any historian investigating the story, even if they weren't wholly convinced, would have to lean in the direction of saying it's plausible. It's certainly not fabricated, unless you start with a predisposition to say, there is no God, there can't be anything supernatural. No matter what it says, I will not believe it. And if that's where you start, that is a bias that is preventing you from seeing the truth. The truth is, from the vantage point of any reasonable, open-minded historian, the story of Jesus is incredibly plausible, and I would say it's definitely true.